Welcome back, everyone. So yesterday we talked about the Samsung Galaxy Z Flip. Now we're going to have to talk about the original Samsung Galaxy Fold and see how this phone holds up in 2021. Now, as most of you know, this was a very interesting, specific device that Samsung made at the time. It came out in 2019 and then it got re-released later on in the year because there were some huge problems with it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the fact that this thing, is kind of like a rare item, it hasn't really been super popular as far as I can tell, but Samsung is, geniuses that they are more than just a phone company. They make tons of products, but one thing they do is supply their panels to a lot of other manufacturers. So even if nobody picks up this phone right now, there is still a huge, future of foldable devices. And I think Samsung really wanted to be one of the first to make these types of displays, take those R&D risks to be like, oh my God, these are the problems, and then, continuously improve their panels. So then someone like Apple or OnePlus or whoever will reach out to Samsung to make their panels. So even if they don't make a lot of money off their phones, they're going to make a lot of money off their panels one way or another. So if you want to pick one of these things up or the Z Fold 2, I'll leave links in the description. You can pick them up from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, there were two different screens on this thing. The front had a 4.6-inch Super AMOLED display with 720p, but unfolded, it had that 7.3-inch dynamic AMOLED display, and this one was 1500p, so over 1440p, which is great. And both these panels actually weren't that bad. Now, folded, it was a little bit different. It looked kind of like a DS Lite, It had a little bit of bezel around it, actually a lot of bezel on today's standards, but unfolded, it looks so much better. Now with the Z Fold 2, they really improved it quite a bit. It's kind of unfortunate because nobody really talks about it, because there's not that much hype about it. But this phone at the time, there was so much hype, but the panel on the front wasn't that great. But the, unfolded panel was seriously extremely impressive. You had pretty much the camera set up in the corner, which really wasn't that bad, but I think overall this panel unfolded was a really good panel for sure. It's really not a thing I have too many complaints about. Now you did have USB-C on this thing, which is great. You had, I think, the headphone jack, which probably wasn't there, I don't really remember. You did not have a microSD card slot on this thing either, which was very sad because Samsung Galaxy S10 came out at that time, which was one of my favorite phones, and fortunately that thing had an SD card slot, but we could have seen this coming eventually. 2 years later, Samsung would take out their SD cards from all their phones, which is very sad in my opinion. And on the back of that glass bag with that triple camera setup, which was actually pretty good. And you still had things like wireless charging and reverse wireless charging, which was really, really great. But I think overall, the way this phone still holds up is actually pretty impressive. I will tell you though, the one problem that this phone had, there were a lot of problems, but the one main problem was that the display, since it did have that plastic coating, you could theoretically just kind of tear the display away from the specific area, and there could have been a lot of dust and debris that get stuck in that little crevice. Samsung did eventually fix it. I think you can still peel the display off though, but I still think it's totally okay. Most people are not going to do that, and since it's folded all the time, I think it's pretty much okay. Now let's go and hit on the cameras. So this thing, like I mentioned, had that triple camera setup on the back, that wide angle lens, telephoto lens, and ultra wide sensor, and I think this camera was actually pretty good. I think one thing that I loved about this screen was the fact that it was pretty much just a massive viewfinder for your specific camera. So you could go ahead and, use this phone however you wanted to, but when it came down to using that camera, it was almost like you were seeing through the phone, which is so crazy. It's kind of hard to explain. Maybe it's kind of like the same thing when you use an iPad, but the screen on this thing is so massive, so I really liked it. Now you can do 4K at 60, which is great, and I really do think the camera overall is a solid, camera for sure. Is it perfect? Not really, but I think it got the job done, and I think it's an extremely good sensor still. There really isn't too much to complain about that I can see in my head. Now, like I mentioned, it's not perfect. There's no 8K, I guess. That's kind of becoming the thing Samsung's known for. But I definitely do think the camera on this thing is still a really solid camera. If you're planning on picking it up, I think you're going to have a pretty good time with it. Now you did have that dual camera setup on the front, a 10 megapixel wide angle lens, then an 8 megapixel wide angle lens. Unfortunately, I don't know why they didn't have like an ultra wide or something, but I think it's still okay for the most part. Like this camera is still fairly good. Now on the front there was another 10 megapixel sensor, which basically allowed you to, I'm not really even too sure. I mean, it was just like when the screen was folded. It really didn't bring you any, I guess, crazier capability than the unfolded one did, than the folded one did, but I still think that's still a really good thing about this, phone for sure. It had like so many cameras on it. And luckily for us, we could still do 4K at 60 on the front camera as well. So I think that's another W in my opinion. Again, it probably wasn't the best camera setup, but it's still pretty good so far. So in terms of the camera, thumbs up for me for sure. Now hitting on the software and the battery, I mean, this is probably one of the best and weirder aspects of this phone. So first of all, the software, obviously it's running One UI. I think I got One UI 3 not too long ago, and Samsung has weirdly, they've supported their phones a little bit longer, so we got that extra year software updates. But the problem with this phone that I've seen time and time again is that Samsung with their Fold series, they kind of push this update further than like their Galaxy S series, and it gets almost the same life cycle as like their A series, like when the release happens. And I think that's very weird, you know what I mean? Like this phone costs so much, so why is it getting why is it delayed this much in terms of software updates? I think it's mostly because they have to rework the software for a foldable display, and not a lot of people own these phones, so I think it's very weird that Samsung does it, but I hope they really improve it. And on top of that, if we're wishing, I hope Samsung goes and releases a stock version of software at some point. I think that would be a really cool thing. Again, there's no way to make sure it happens or anything, but I really hope Samsung does something like this at some point. So I think in terms of that standpoint, overall, it gets a thumbs up for me. I think the software is still pretty good. I just don't like the software versions, and I don't like the software, itself. But I think most people are going to be okay with it, and the fact that it's still getting software support is good enough for me for sure. But the battery size and the life of it was something that was very interesting, because since then we've gotten bigger sized batteries without having a foldable phone. So what Samsung said at this time is that there's technically like 2 batteries inside of it. And it had a 4300 mAh battery, which I think is great, but it's funny because we have like the Galaxy S21 Plus and the Galaxy S20 Ultra that have like 5000 mAh batteries. So I think it's very interesting. I still think the battery life is pretty good on this thing, but I think for sure the fact that it has reverse wireless charging is still a really cool feature, and ultimately I think it's a pro for sure. So software and battery life, that pretty much covers it up. Now ending it off with the performance, this device had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 chipset, an octa-core CPU, an Adreno 640 GPU, and 12 gigs of RAM on the single model that it came out with. And I think when it comes down to the performance standpoint of this device, as I mentioned before, it's a solid performing device still. Now when it's folded, I feel like it's faster than when it's unfolded because it has less pixels to push, but either or, this is still an extremely fast phone without a doubt. Really, anything you're going to do with it, in my opinion, it's going to be able to handle it perfectly fine. Now, the only thing in my opinion that does kind of date it is the lack of 120 hertz or 90 hertz. That's kind of become a standard across the board, and unfortunately we don't get it from this device. I still think it's okay though. It still feels plenty smooth, it still feels plenty fast, but it would have been cool had this thing had a little bit more capability when it came down to that. However, really for every other purposes you're going to use this phone for, it's going to be perfectly fine. One thing that I love about this phone is the experience when it comes down to the performance. The fact that you have that big of a display on this phone is extremely impressive, and as I mentioned before, it's one of my favorite things that I love about this phone. The fact that you can go ahead and boot up, maybe like Google Docs on one side and take your notes on the other side of the screen. I really love that. But also, let's say you want to go ahead and have YouTube playing on one side, a full YouTube app, and something else on the other side. It just makes it feel that much better of an experience, and it makes it feel that much more dynamic in my opinion. I just feel like this is the way it should be. When I have my phone and it's like, the landscape and it's like portrait and I have like one app on top of the other, I like that. I think it's fine. But something like the iPad way, I really like that stuff for sure. So without a doubt, I think the performance is great. There's not that much to complain about. Again, it's not perfect, but I think still it's not even that dated when it comes down to it. So in terms of the performance, that pretty much covers it up. Now to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, should you go and buy a Samsung Galaxy Fold, the original one, in 2021? Well, this is what I'll pretty much tell you. I think this phone has definitely evolved, but I really do think the Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 2, whatever they called it, I think that is a worthwhile upgrade for sure. You're getting a better display both on the front and back. You're getting, I think a more durable phone for sure. And I really do think that is a worthwhile upgrade from this phone. If you have to get a, foldable phone, I think that one is kind of like a no-brainer in my opinion. I will tell you though, I think this original Fold is still a really good device. I think it still has a ton going for it. Things like that front screen, it still isn't even that bad. You're really not going to use it that much. The camera setup on this phone is very, very good still. I have very little complaints about the camera layout for sure. The screen inside is still very good as well. This thing has a massive size battery. The performance is great. There's not that much to complain about besides the software. I think the software update lifecycle is very strange for this device specifically, considering it's this expensive. But I also feel like the software, without it being stock, it just feels so strange. And I'm not really a huge fan of that. If this thing was a work in progress, if it was whatever, if this wasn't the future, then I think it's whatever. But I think foldable phones are here to stay. And I really hope Samsung can go and improve their software, make it more stock, make it, just improve it in that sense, because they make beautiful phones. Every single other thing about this phone is still pretty much up to date, except the software. If Samsung can fix that, I think they're going to have another hit on their hands for sure whenever the Z Fold 3 comes out. But I think that really pretty much covers it up with this device. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.